All right. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Only the panelists are displayed and heard, but we do want to hear from you. Please, as we go through the presentation, if you have questions for our speakers, use the Q&A button on your Zoom panel, not the chat, to ask those questions, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end. If you do put your questions in the chat, we won't see them, so make sure you use that Q&A button. We will share both the slides for this presentation as well as a recording as soon as possible after the session is over. And I want to make sure that you stay towards the end, or if you're watching the replay, watch towards the end, because we have a special offer for everyone who registered for the webinar that we're going to announce at the end of the session today. My name is Raquel Cloyd, and I manage business development and partnerships here at Intellect. We have two great guest speakers here today. Mark Swanson and Steve Gompertz are partners at QRx Partners, a quality and regulatory consulting firm. Mark is an active member of several ISO working groups and is a subject matter expert in quality management systems, risk management, design and development, and continuous improvement. Steve might be a familiar face to you if you've attended our past webinars. He has spoken on several topics for Intellect. He has over 30 years of experience in quality and medical technology, is an adjunct instructor at St. Cloud University in Minnesota, is a SQA distinguished speaker, and an MFES distinguished engineer. Both Mark and Steve are here to share their expertise in ISO regulation, upcoming changes, and what trends and challenges lay ahead for quality professionals and their organizations in 2025 and beyond. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about Intellect. We are an award-winning quality management and environmental health and safety software company built on a no-code platform and powered with a robust AI integration. We help companies to automate quality processes, improve operational efficiency, and achieve their quality and compliance goals. Those goals include maintaining compliance with ISO, FDA, GXP, OSHA regulations, and more. Whether you are a company in med device, biotech, aerospace, automotive, electronics, or general manufacturing, you can rely on Intellect to reduce operational risk, improve profitability, and increase revenue. If you would like to see a demo of any of our applications, at any time, you can just type in demo into the Q&A button on the Zoom panel or visit us online at intellect.com. Before we begin with Mark and Steve, we have a poll for you today. What standards or compliance frameworks are your company aligned with or planning to align with this year or in the near future? We're going to give everybody a minute or so to answer the question. Looks like we have about a quarter of our attendees answer right now. So I'd love it if everyone could participate, because we really want to hear from you. This also will help us determine what kind of content we can have for you in future webinars as well. All right, we've got about not quite 3/4 of our attendees answering. We'll go ahead and we'll share the results as soon as we are done with the poll. All right. All right, let's see here. Let's share the results. Here we go. It looks like the majority is very much interested in ISO 9001. So you are at the right webinar for sure. And we have some who are interested in aerospace standards, med device with 13485, 14001, 27001, which is the cybersecurity, 45001. Great. IATF. All right, 21 CFR, CLIA. Perfect. ITAR. Okay. And some aren't sure. No problem. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That will help us know what our audience is interested in. All right, today's agenda, ISO 9001, where we've been, where we're going. That's why you're here. What are the likely changes that are based on the design specification for 9000, 9001? What are the implications for your teams and your quality departments? How can you prepare for the revisions that are coming? What are some emerging trends in manufacturing and the future of quality management as related to the standard or in general? What tools, resources, and other opportunities are available to you? And then, of course, we're going to have our interactive Q&A. So as our speakers are presenting, again, please enter your questions into the Q&A button on the Zoom panel. All right, well, I'm going to hand it over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Raquel. Yeah, it really is good to see that the majority of the the people here are on 9001, 90+% look like had this. We'll try to give some of this background and make sure you understand the foundation. As always, we can only cover so much material in the 45 minutes that we have or so, and we know questions are going to happen at the end. Do enter your questions in that Q&A panel, and we'll do what we can to follow up and make sure that we answer all of your questions. So with that, we'll just kind of dive in. Both 9000 and 9001 were last published in 2015. This was a major revision as it went from the 2008 version to in 2015. We went from the 8 clauses that were there to 10 clauses that are in the current revision of 2015. It feels weird to still be calling it, I have to say, the current revision, because we've been working more than a year now on the next revision of 9000 and 9001. Okay. For many people, and it created a little bit of upset, Amendment 1 was published in 2024 to 9001, as well as several other management system standards. This was done by ISO Technical Management Board, so at the highest levels of ISO, published that climate change, it's colloquial called the Climate Change Amendment, to all the management system standards, where you have to understand the impact of potential climate change and the inputs to your product. Again, ISO didn't perceive this really as a major change because you already had to account for the relevant interested parties and these inputs, and so they were just specifically highlighting that environmental piece in 2024 with that amendment. Okay. The current standard was aligned with the high-level structure. You hear various terms: harmonized approach, harmonized structure, Annex SL. All of these things come from the ISO and IEC directives, but that last alignment was done in 2014. The high-level structure has changed, had updates 3 different times since then. And so much of this standard and the intent of this was to realign with the high-level structure, and particularly the definitions that are there and some of the other concepts that are coming along with that those changes in the high-level structure. So again, much of what we'll talk about is there's no real significant changes in requirements, but rather the changes in structure, the additional definitions, these types of things. So as you go in and start preparing, you're going to have to just understand what these differences and the changes are. All right. So as we started talking about this subject, one of the things that comes up most often is understanding the background and what, the content, where the requirements come from. And to be able to talk about the requirements, you need to talk about ISO 9000. And most people will recognize ISO 9000 and they think about that being the definitions. And the terms and definitions are in Section 3. I know I saw one person mention the QMSR. It's a piece that's specifically called out by the FDA as Section 3 in ISO 9000 2015 as having terms and definitions. And while that is an important part, there is a more important part to me, is that Section 2, which really are the fundamental concepts of quality management systems, the quality management principles, and then a nice little section on the work you need to do to develop your quality management system, your QMS. Okay.
Mark, if I could just interject here, again, I think if you could just go back a slide,
Yeah.
9000, it's interesting. We've talked about this before. We've seen this lots out there where companies that are certified to 9001 are conforming to 9001, and then you ask about 9000, and they kind of tilt their head. And I think it's important to really stress, if you're going to purchase 9001, then also purchase 9000, because the concepts in 9001 or 1345 or lots of quality related standards all have their foundation in 9000. So if you haven't read section 2 of ISO 9000, you actually don't have the context to understand the part of the standards that are going to apply to you.
And it
So
is what's
it's worth
called a
discussing.
normative. It is what's called a normative reference. And what normative reference means is all of the content of that normative reference is also requirements in the standard that you're reading. And so as you see any standard that has a normative reference to another standard, that means that that's also a requirement.
Probably would have been interesting to put a poll up to say how many of you have bought both.
Yeah. Well, and I'll come back to this at the end, but when we talk about resources, um, the definitions you can actually get for free through the online browsing platform and ISO. So it brings real no value to you to just get it for terms and definitions. So you would only buy it to me for those concepts, principles, and that information on developing your quality management system. Okay? Just flipping back over to 9001 again, just so we stay engaged on both fronts, and so, again, where this comes from. 9001 2015 formally introduced that risk-based approach. Now, I will tell you that many of us didn't really think this was a big deal or a big change. There's no need to have a formal risk-based approach procedure or process. Um, but in everything you do, you should consider what the risk is as you do that and work to mitigate risk. Every procedure and process has some risk associated with it. Just having a written procedure tells you that you're trying to mitigate some risk so people follow that process, right? And so, what risk are you trying to mitigate by having a written process? What do you need to add to that process to further mitigate risk? A very common one that I bring up is document control, especially as we went through COVID. People were on a paper-based system, and all of a sudden, how do I get that routed for a signature when there's nobody in the office? Um, these types of things. And so it might behoove you to have an electronic system. These types of things as you manage the risk. All right. Again, 9001 was realigned with 10 sections. The intent there was not to have direct changes in any of the requirements, but rather realign it. Now, what this realignment did is, as many of us went through this, it changed us from an engineering focus in design and development to an operational focus on what are the services and products that we're producing, and how do we deliver those things, that operational focus. And then we also brought in the service concepts. So we split it into two pieces where it talked about products and services, and a real focus on the service companies to be able to create a way for them to comply with 9001, that it was not just for products. Okay. All right. So why are we changing? I talked about it a little bit earlier. Annex SL to the ISO IEC directives. Uh, the reason it has an S in front of it, it means that it only applies to ISO standards. It does not apply to IEC standards. Okay, so that's the Annex S, and then SL is SA through, I think it's SN. But SL is in Appendix 2 is noted as a harmonized approach. So you can see another thing, you see this HAMSS lots of times, that's been updated. There is a joint technical committee that works directly for the technical management board that updates Appendix 2. They are out of cycle with the directives because there's a hyperlink in the directives to Appendix 2. And so they can update this whenever they feel a need to update that. And they've, like I said, they've done it at least 3 times. There's another revision in process right now. Okay. But that updated some of the required text. It updated some of um, the definitions and terms that were listed in there. The latest revision also gave significant wiggle room, I'll call it, to the definition of the term risk, because there's a lot of upset between different sectors on how that was being handled in the harmonized approach. And so They've corrected that in the latest revision of the Appendix 2. Okay. In addition, TC 176, which is the group involved in this, did a user survey. And so they received user feedback on things that they needed to clarify. This particularly comes from auditing agencies and people that, when they have their audits, that there's some clarification needed in some of the areas. And so you'll see this, and we'll talk about this in a minute as I talk through the changes coming to ISO 9000. Okay. And then there's this whole area that's typically called emerging trends and concepts, sustainability goals, those types of things that come up in emerging trends. Obviously, AI or artificial intelligence and machine learning has been a concept that's come to the forefront recently, and those types of things, and trying to handle those within the context of 9000 and 9001. Okay. And so those are the things that are driving the change. So that's kind of, where we were and why we're changing and those types of things. Now we talk about some of the likely changes. Now, I will be straight up with you that I can't tell you all of the details, even if we had several hours to go through them, because that's part of the ISO working process and working group, and ISO would consider that confidential information. But I can talk about them from a high level standpoint and things that are likely but not fixed yet, because we're still in the committee draft stage and haven't moved to a draft standard that's public yet. These are just general areas, general concepts, and potential things that are coming forth. So, just take all of that with that knowledge. Okay. All right. So the committee draft for ISO 9000 and talking about some of the fundamental concepts. The items that are listed in green are those that are in the current 2015 edition, the current publication of 9000. The ones that are in blue are the additional fundamental concepts that are being added. And so you can already see on this first page the clarifications that are coming to the concept of quality management, what continual improvement means, quality planning, quality assurance, quality control, process management. All of these fundamental concepts that are being talked about and further developed within the 9001 framework. These are areas that the user feedback came in and said, we need you to provide additional clarification on what these concepts are. We're going from 5 fundamental concepts to more than 20. So you can understand the amount of content, the amount of information that's being put in this foundational document, 9000, is going to greatly enhance the understanding of quality management throughout all of the industries that rely on ISO 9000. Okay. As we go forward, then we can start talking about some additional concepts. What does it mean to have an integrated management system? We had that question at the beginning very intentionally to understand, we thought that we would have a whole bunch of people in 9001, right? But there's people working with other standards, even within the context of working with 9001. It's why you could choose more than one, right? So 45,001 in safety, and 14,001 in environmental, 27,001 in information security. All of these things need to be integrated together. Again, this was one of the big concepts that comes through when you talk about that harmonized approach, that high-level structure, so that those standards are organized in the same way, so it allows you to lay them on top of each other and have an integrated management system. And that's a concept that, again, that needs some further explanation and is being outlined within ISO 9000. Okay.
Hey, Mark, just a quick clarification question, and this might relate to a question on the Q&A. The emerging technology section, is that just meant to be kind of a generalized how to deal with changing technologies, or is it going to get into specific technologies? The question in Q&A was whether or not AI was going to be addressed in some way.
In general, AI will be one of the concepts in that area that's going to be specifically talked about. But the idea is to understand as emerging technologies comes forth, how would you deal with it in the context of your quality management system? What changes is it gonna drive? Those types of things. So, um, again, I can't speak to the specific content, but AI will be a concept that's addressed within that. Okay? Hopefully that helps in the clarification, and those types of things. And I was just glancing over. We'll come back to when it's going to be published and that type of stuff. I'll talk about the timeline as we go along. I'll also highlight this other area of risk-based thinking. Again, we introduced that in that formal concept of risk-based thinking in the 2015 edition, but then we didn't explain it very well. And so ISO 9000 has taken a real good shot at that and understanding risk-based thinking. Now, I will tell you that I'm sorry, I just want to go back to the slide. That risk-based thinking concept also then has I don't know if I want to say the flip side of it, but often organizations and we'll talk about risks and opportunities. So now there's also potentially a concept of opportunity-based thinking. And what does that mean, and how does that impact your quality management system? So we're having to try to explain and differentiate what is risk-based thinking versus opportunity-based thinking. Okay. As we move forward, then again, the couple of green ones there, but most of these have been blue. You see how much has been added in change management. Some additional content on interested parties, but this concept of customer experience. Many organizations have talked about, you know, what it means to have customer satisfaction, but this is a bigger area and called customer experience. Often one of the conversations that come up when you're pulled over by a police officer, you're probably not going to end up being very satisfied with that, with that interface, right? But the customer experience has to be well understood so that you have a result that was expected. Those types of things that are in the bigger concept of customer experience versus just customer satisfaction. Okay. Support is lined out there, not because it's really going away. Those three areas that are underneath it are the areas that were in the 2015 edition. It's just that those areas need some additional explanation. And so while it's not called support directly anymore with some subclauses, those clauses are now main clauses in knowledge management, which is much bigger than training. Has to do with competence, organizational competence, those types of things. Managing information, and then managing the people aspects and what it takes in a quality management system to manage all of that. Okay, and that was a lot of additional stuff. You can see again all of those blue things that are being added to 9000 here. Okay, anything to add on that, Steve, before we leave 9000?
Yeah, I was just going to say a good comment came into the Q&A, and I was going to say something along these lines, right? That these don't really represent new requirements as clarifications of concepts that were always there, but not always clear, right? I think it's just kind of natural. Standards tend to start at a more generic level, right? So that they're applicable across a broad, set of possibilities. And then as we find that, oh, people aren't quite getting the gist of this, then we get more specific like this. So,
well, and because I'm so involved in standards development, 9001, 13485, these types of things, I often get asked, well, where did that come from? What's behind that requirement? Well, this is where it comes from. And we didn't want that to be held just with that knowledge and information held just within the technical committee and the working groups anymore. We want this to be published so that people fully understand, where do these requirements come from? What are all the things that you need to manage within a quality management system? And what is the fundamental idea or concept behind it? Let's publish that. That's why we've expanded this so much in 9000. That was the overall user feedback is, look, your family of standards that are being handled in TC 176, we don't understand, where all these things are coming from. And, the 10,000 series of standards and all of those types of things, what are the concepts that are behind those? Can't we put them all in one place? ISO 9000 seemed like the right place to put all of those. And so that's what this opportunity came to be. Okay. All right. So then we can talk about the design specification and the information in 9001. The purpose, title, and field of application are unchanged. This was directly balloted by the technical committee that would be the case. So you can say, look, we're talking about the same general area of quality management systems. Okay. Annex SL, we've talked about, again, Appendix 2, providing the template and guidance for developing the standard. That updated Annex SL is part of the design specification. We keep the foundation in the process approach, which is PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act, and risk-based thinking, that proactive preventive action. That we're always thinking about what the potential risks are and taking that preventive action. So you're not going to see the return of a preventive action clause. It's still going to say this very similar in clause 10. There's a little bit reorganization of the clauses, that continual improvement will be first, and then talking about other improvements. Okay. But generally, the foundation stays the same. Okay. And then changes to requirements can only be introduced through the working group, through the comments, where there's a confidence of benefit. There is an actual assessment tool that was developed. And so as any new requirements were considered, whether they came from the need to consider artificial intelligence, the need to consider circular economy, other user inputs on opportunity-based thinking and risk-based thinking, these types of things, that there's an assessment tool that's being used by the working group in order to assess where that would bring in some benefit to the users. Okay. And I want to be stressful about that. It's about benefit to the users. Has little to do with auditing agencies. It has to do with the end users in making sure that they have a quality management system that you have some confidence in, right? So getting certified to 9001 needs to mean something. And so that's where we talk about the benefit. Okay. As we continue through, for 9001, quality management system and evolving technologies, particularly that we're not solely based in paper anymore. Everybody understands that. In fact, and many times we're not even in what you might be able to call a printable document. It's working in virtual reality. It's working in recordings and information that's in a verbal format, not necessarily a quote unquote written format, right? I can't print a document. Things are evolving because it's automated. As we look at automated processes and those types of things, we have to be able to have ways of having the adequate documented information in using those evolving technologies. If you have used artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, or those other things, you understand that if I ask a question today, the same question maybe I asked 3 or 6 or 9 months ago, you can often get a different answer. based on the data that was uploaded into that artificial intelligence, that machine learning. So some of these things have to be accounted for within your management systems. Okay. We will remain generic and applicable to all sizes and types of organizations. Many people, made a big deal about some of the required documents that went away, that you don't require a quality manual anymore. You don't require, some of these things that were considered maybe foundational. But the idea is that, a mom and pop organization versus a multinational corporation have different requirements because they're risk-based. And so not everybody needs a quality manual. Not everybody needs, individual written processes. But to manage risk adequately, different corporations need different things. To me, and what we pass on to our clients is risk-based approach really allows you to right size your documentation, your documented information to your organization, to how you function, what's your purpose, and those types of things. All right. And then facilitating effective implementation and assessment. We do want this to be clear so that you implement it and auditors are auditing it in the same way. That there's not a misunderstanding, that there's less room for misinterpretation or interpretation differently than what we intended. Okay. Then moving on, we're promoting an integrated approach by having the high-level structure, by being updated to the most recent piece. We're moving that forward, ensuring requirements are adequate and alignment with the fundamental concepts that are being updated in ISO 9000. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I know you're not done yet, but I just wanted to interject with a quick question for everyone here. So we want to know how you're currently managing documents and records that you need to show an auditor during an audit. We'll take a moment to launch the poll. Are you using paper, as Mark was just talking about, storing it in binders, filing cabinets? We definitely still see that. Perhaps you're using spreadsheets, or maybe using something like Google Drive or OneDrive to manage your documents. Do you
Or
have a
maybe you
dedicated?
made the leap forward to using some sort of an artificial intelligence integrated system.
Yep,
Maybe.
definitely. Dedicated DMS, maybe you have an EQMS where you have document control capabilities within that, or another system like an MES or an ERP. So we've got just over half of our attendees who've answered the question. We'd love for everyone to participate. We'll just give that a few more seconds. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and see where everyone's at. Okay, it looks like the majority
just
using
spread across.
spreadsheets. Yeah, it is pretty spread across. We do have quite a few still kind of using those spreadsheets or some sort of shared drive. And then the rest are pretty evenly divided amongst paper and software systems. All right, thanks, everyone. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, it's interesting as you talk about, people using network drives. Well, do you have limited access to those things? How are you protecting those from changes? All of those types of things are, the questions that then come up. How are you that's where that risk-based approach, how are you managing the risk for those documents, to make sure that, you've adequately mitigated that risk. Okay. We wanted to cover just some overall thoughts and pieces as we make these changes. There's not intended to be any what I call quote unquote significant changes to requirements. It's always an interesting discussion because you can rearrange a couple of words without changing the requirement, and people will point that out as a change. Because they'll want to interpret it differently. There's no real intent to make any significant changes like that. Most of the things that came out through that assessment tool, the amount of work to implement, were not worth the cost that we need to do. So many changes are not being directly incorporated. Again, it's up to your organization to understand where your risk is and use that risk-based approach to decide whether or not you need to make any changes for those things. One area that I know people will consider being a change is this whole what we've colloquially called the separation of risk and opportunity. Um, Risk and opportunity are not two sides of a coin. Just because there's risk there doesn't mean there's opportunity there. So we wanted to understand that somehow we needed to separate those concepts into managing risk and risk-based approach, risk-based thinking, versus how are you ensuring that your organization follows through with the appropriate opportunities that you have in front of you. And this is where a big misunderstanding is on the definition of risk. And so this is why we felt we needed to separate these concepts of risk and opportunity. And so that's much of the work that's being done in clause 4 and so forth, and talking about the separation of risk and opportunity. Okay. And then the other piece that will come in is there's been a developed Annex A, and Annex A is meant to be clarifications of the concept, versus in 9002, which is the guidance document on 9001, is also going through a revision. And 9002 is meant to be the guidance for implementation, not the guidance for clarification. And that's being very distinct by the working groups. Have a good understanding of that 9002 will be for implementation. Alongside that, there's also something called the SME handbook, or the subject matter expert handbook, that is also being revised with this. But that's more for people that do auditing and people that are implementing quality management systems in very large organizations, that kind of stuff. But so just understand that there's a difference between Annex A clarifications and 9002 implementation. Okay. And really, that's our overall thoughts on how you prepare. You engage, with the process. So as we go through the process, there'll be a next version. There actually 9001 has been slowed down a little bit, and maybe I'll come back to those. So preparing, and you should see my 2020X thing. So the actions to take going forward: remain calm. Understand that, again, I'm just telling you that there's no major changes in requirements. That you can, take some time to understand these. It will have a transition period as well. And so understanding what additional documented information, those types of things that you're going to need to create other pieces. It was recently announced that 9001 would have a second committee draft. There were so many changes in the first committee draft that they felt they couldn't move forward with that unless it went through a second inquiry or a second commenting period. So the technical experts, the national bodies will get another chance to comment on this. If you belong to those national standards bodies, like ASQ, like AMI for med device, or those international, for those people that are internationals, each country has a national standards bodies. The national standards bodies will get that, and it should come out as publication tomorrow, the second committee draft. And so you guys are maybe ahead of or understanding where this is from most people, but that second committee draft is intended to be published tomorrow. So that has extended the timeline. It was originally on a 24-month schedule, and that's been extended to a 36-month schedule. So it's likely 9001 will be published in Q4 of 2027. Now, what that's meant, though, because 9000 didn't need to go through that second committee draft, ISO 9000 will likely be published towards the end of 2026. And so that an entire year ahead of time, understanding those concepts. What that allows is, of course, then alignment with the concepts that are being published in 9000, but it also allows you to have an understanding of what's coming in the publication of 9001 because those concepts are going to be followed. And so I would say, look at ISO 9000 as that gets published as kind of your guiding document going forward. Okay. And then stay aware of the draft again when they're issued for public comment. So the stages that they go through, it's currently at the committee draft stage. The next stage is what's called a DIS or draft industry standard. That is when they come out for public comment. You're able to obtain those from your national standards bodies. You're able to submit comments on what you believe, might be need for clarification or problems with suggested changes and those types of things. Everybody is able to do that. Again, ASQ would be the lead authority here in the U.S. Other countries will have to, talk about your national standards bodies. Okay, so make sure you stay in connected with that. All right. Just a couple of emerging trends just wanted to talk about. Of course, align your QMS with the global trends in sustainability, digital transformation, risk-based or opportunity-based thinking. These types of things will help you get ahead of and right-size your quality management system to your organization. The integration of AI and automation, and I always say with precautions. AI, you always have to understand what data is it drawing from, and be careful because it draws from everything that's available to it often, and so it can make mistakes because it's given bad information. And so you always need to do it. As I work with AI and we talk about different things, on average, AI gives the incorrect answer around 5 to 6% of the time. And so if you're faced with making a mistake 5 or 6% of the time, understand that there's a risk there and you need to appropriately mitigate that by verifying, the data that it comes from, the background information, and that kind of stuff. Okay. And then explore innovations in quality management and shift to an integrated management system. I was just added to the ISO Technical Management Committee on developing an integrated management system standard. And that'll be a standard that'll come out from ISO on talking about integrating your management systems and how they all work together. Often the environmental is one, so second to 9001 is ISO 14001, the environmental standard in certifications. And so understanding how that can impact your organization and those types of things. Okay. And with that, I want to mention, so you have a view to it, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So ISO in the development of all of their standards now have to identify the sustainable development goals being supported by that standard. And so as you look at all of these types of things, these 17 listed sustainable development goals by the United Nations, understand how these things have an impact on your organization and integrate it into your quality management system. All right. Just a few more slides we want to go through and try to leave some time for questions. I'll go through this rather quickly. So you have electronic systems in the electronic quality management system, the use of artificial intelligence, standard subscriptions. So there's organizations like IHS and TechStreet and several other ones out there where you can subscribe to standards and get notifications when they change, when the drafts become available, those types of things. And you can always go back and look at the web pages, ISO.org. I'm calling out here specifically. The reason for that is because you can go on to the ISO page for ISO 9001 and see its current status in its revision. You can also, there's a view thing where you can view the informative section, the lead-in pieces of the standard for free. You just won't get the requirements as you go through looking at those. So every ISO standard is available on the ISO webpage. So that usually includes the introduction, the scope statement, the definitions. Those things are generally the pieces that are all available for free on the ISO webpage. Okay, just some resources. I mentioned ASQ earlier, mentioned RAPS, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. Of course, your certification bodies that you're working with to get your cert. In med device, we talk about Medical Alley Association, and then these any consulting services like what we provide. And the last piece I just want to mention here, it talks about grants and fundings. So there is, at least from the U.S. Government, there's lots of money out there that you can look for. The National Institutes of Health is looking for products and types of things that can be supported. Understanding through COVID, through the problems with cancer, all of those types of things, many things are funded through the National Institutes of Health. There's another government agency called the Advanced Research Project Agency, or ARPA. And I put ARPA H on here. That has to do with particularly with healthcare and healthcare related products. And then the network, and just call it the Network Grant Agency. So SBIR, small business resources, and other venture capital firms are, of course, the places to look for. We want to put these out there, and again, you can contact us because we tend to work with small companies and startups, and so we understand that you need to go through the granting process and look for funding, and maybe some non-traditional funding sources. And I think that was my last slide.
All right. Thank you, Mark and Steve. We will be having a Q&A session in just a minute. Now would be a good time to enter your questions into the Q&A button on the Zoom panel. Again, not in the chat. We won't see them if they're in the chat. Now to that special offer before we get into the Q&A that I referenced at the beginning of the webinar. For those companies who are pursuing ISO certification or recertification in the next year, Intellect is offering a free ISO readiness assessment session. So now through February 7th, you can meet with a quality systems engineer with Intellect who has successfully guided many ISO certifications and recertifications. You can go over how to prepare, what are the steps you need to take. We actually have a 7-step process that we've used for our own ISO certifications, and that has been used at other organizations. It's been vetted by external ISO auditors. So this is completely free to all webinar registrants. You can type in the word assessment into the Q&A button on the Zoom panel, and we'll reach out to you to get that scheduled, or we will send more details in a follow-up email as well. And then again, of course, if you'd like to see a demo of our software, simply type in demo into the Q&A button as well. So we'll be monitoring that area throughout the webinar, and we'll be in touch afterwards. If you would like to get in touch with Mark and Steve of QRx Partners, here's their contact information. Again, we'll be sending out the slide deck after the session today, so you'll have that in an email. You can reach out to them via email or on LinkedIn. You can scan the QR code here on this panel and schedule a custom demo of our QMS software. And then I'd like to invite everyone to join in our QMS Best Practices webinar series. We've got 2 coming up in February, one geared towards life sciences and med device, 5 signs it's time to revamp your QMS in 2025. And the second in February will be for the electronics industry, 5 warning signs your QMS could be costing you. So you can go to intellect.com to register for those, or the slide deck will have the link to take you to the registration page. All right, let's go into the Q&A. I know we've got a lot of questions. Steve is going to be kind of fielding those questions. So Steve, if you want to go ahead and announce the question,
Sure.
we can get started.
Yeah. So Mark, I thought this question was kind of interesting, and they talk about, with the growth of the exponentially growing cases for things like AI, ML, big data. Is it expected that ISO standards might come out or update more frequently as a result of
that? I think that we'd like that to be the case, maybe. Mm-hmm. But ISO processes are dictated again by the directives. The standard review cycle is a 5-year cycle. And so you asked me about, I think we asked earlier, maybe even about 14,001 or 45,001 and all those types of things. I don't see those being updated any sooner than their standard review cycle. If there's needs to do so, and again, there's opportunities you can actually directly contact the ISO organization and submit information to them and say it needs to change because of this. I think that most people that are involved in standards development take a little bit different view to that, that while AI and the use of AI and how it's being used is developing quickly, it is simply another tool like any other tool that's used out there. And the tools generally, I'll say, regulate themselves, that, how they're being used and the effective use. And the systems will continue to support the use of those tools. So I don't see it being needing to be any quicker than what we've been typically doing. That makes sense?
Kind of related to that, there was a couple of questions that kind of go together here, so I'm going to combine them. You've already kind of touched on, and you just did, right, the impact of updating 9,000 on other management system standards like 14,001, 45,001.
Yeah.
In the comments, somebody made note of that aerospace is expected to work on a revision to like AS 9100.
I think
may
next
change the
year.
name. And the question is, do you think those will wait while the updates to 9,000 and 9,001 come out?
No, I don't think there's any need for them to wait. They do depend somewhat on that, but I mean, we're able to behind the scenes because it's all an ISO property. We're able to share that information with the working groups that are working on those types of things, so they can see some of that information ahead of time to be able to start working on the revision. So there's not a need for them to wait, and so they should, press forward because they'll be able to see that information behind the scenes. Now, again, they won't be able to. It'll seem strange to maybe the industry because 9001 will come out, and then shortly after that the AS 9100 might change. They're like, wait, they relied on each other. It's up to the working group to make sure that they remain aligned. And that's all I can say, and that's why I think it's important for industry to comment if they see a misalignment as those come out as draft standards to the standards development organizations. And I think there was mention of a question on Canada. The Standards Council of Canada is the standards development organization in Canada. That and actually the lead agency in the United States is ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. ASQ just happens to be 49001. Those types of things. So I think there won't be a delay there. Those standards will move forward in their revisions.
Okay. Somebody asked if you could touch a little bit more on the thought behind separating risk and opportunity.
Yeah, I think many people again misinterpret that risk and opportunity are two sides of a coin. That where there's a risk, there's also an opportunity. And that can generally be true. Or sometimes, many times be true. It's not always true. And the problem with writing it the way it was written in 2015 was that risks and opportunities were put together. And so many people were forced in their document information as they were assessing those things. They were saying, well, there's risks here, but there's also opportunities. Again, that can be the case, but there's opportunities that have a lower risk associated with them. So we need to separate that thinking a little bit, so that we're talking about what are the opportunities, and then we can talk about, well, what's the risks associated with that too? Or we can talk about the risks, and then we can say, yeah, but there's also opportunities there. So to not put that as two sides of a coin, but separate those two conversations into risks and opportunities. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's clear.
Yeah. This is pretty good tactical question here. You talked about the expected release, dates or timeline. Somebody's wondering, so after it gets released, when will they have to be in compliance relative to their next audit?
So I have to separate things a little bit here maybe for you. The certification bodies, the accrediting bodies for certification bodies determine what the time period is for what I'll call the grace period. Okay, ISO does not get involved in that. Um, they will have the standard available until a back revision is always available, right? So when the 2026 or 2027 version gets published, you'll still be able to purchase the 2015 edition. And you could claim compliance until your certification body can't provide a certification to that anymore. Almost always, that's a 3-year period. So because it's been deemed that's kind of a industry standard for transition is 3 years. By that third year, you have to be transitioned to the new version. That's again, I can say that in general, but until the accreditation forum comes out and says it, and that's why to be in contact with your certification body. When are they going to expect you transition? Talk to them.
Yep. All right, looks like we maybe have time for one more, and this might not be a short answer. So, somebody mentioned that they're having difficulty with their top management explaining the importance of the recent amendment to Section 4, and they're wondering if there are any tips.
Yeah, I had mentioned that just earlier about that the environmental amendment is generally what it's called. And there was, it's 2 lines of the standard. The intent there was to draw attention to, the need to consider the environmental impacts, is what I'll say. It was already there. You already had to do anything that was relevant to your organization. I think that what was happening was many organizations were just not even considering it. Now that it's sitting there right in front of them, they have to consider what the environmental impact is. I can give some examples of those types of things. Many of us in the med device industry have been impacted by the waste electronics requirements, right? And throwing the product away. We have to understand what is the impact of that. What recycling processes should we put in place? What's the other pieces of a circular economy that we could be considering? Those types of things. It is not meant to force you to do something that you shouldn't have already been considering, is what I'll say. It's meant to make you think and say, okay, now I have to actually think what things do how do I impact the environment? You talk about service organizations and sending service technicians all over the place. Well, that's flights, right? And so now I have to consider what my carbon, footprint is because I have all of these people going all over the place. Us as consultants, do I really need to travel there or could I do it via Zoom? These types of things, and how can I potentially reduce my environmental impact? These are the types of things that they're wanting you to consider now. Not that you should have been considering those already again, but just you have to think about it. What impact do I have? And really, when the second part of that, the note is talking about inputs, or looking at what your relevant interested parties might have as feedback. If I'm sending product back and forth, can I use the same container and not have to use additional cardboard? Those types of things. That's what it's looking for. Hopefully those examples give you something, an understanding of what you need to do. I will note that it doesn't say you need to do something about it. It says you need to consider it. Okay? And understand what it is. And then your organization decides whether or not you need to do something about it. What's the risk? Right? What's the risk of looking bad to our customers, looking bad to people out there, those types of things. So, just consider what it is and use the risk-based approach. We're supposed to think.
All right, Raquel, I think I'll throw it back to you. I think
Yes, thank
much
you.
time to go.
We're out of time. We always have so many great questions when you guys present. So we really appreciate lots of great information here. Thank you everyone for joining us. If there are more questions, we'll see if we can get them to answer maybe a video recording session and post that on our socials. So thank you again for attending. Thank you so much, Mark and Steve. We appreciate you. Have a great day, everybody.
Of course. Thanks.
Yeah, you can connect with us on LinkedIn as well. We'd love to take questions, you know,
Yep.
anywhere. So.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everybody.